Welcome to Module 9. In this module, you're going to learn more specifically how to apply the principles of behaviorism to changing behavior. One of the key necessities if you're going to use behavioral techniques is that you really need to have good data on the behavior. If a child is throwing temper tantrums 100 times a day, and you try something, and the next week they're throwing temper tantrums 80 times a day, you've made a significant impact on their behavior, but it probably isn't going to feel any different because 80 times a day is still going to feel like they're doing it constantly. And so it's important to have really good data to look at so you can tell whether what you're doing is working. We don't want to take and try techniques and keep doing them just because we heard they're effective if they're not working. So, how do you tell if behavior is working? What kind of data do you want to have? You're going to learn in this module about ABC data. ABC data, which looks at the antecedent, what comes before the behavior, what happens, and then the consequence, which does not mean punishment in this case, it means just everything that happens after the behavior. That ABC data is really good to do when you're trying to figure out what's going on, what the dynamics surrounding this behavior are, because it can help you see patterns that you may not have noticed before. So, for example, if you do this and you see every time the child has a behavior, they get sent to the director's office, you might realize that, maybe the child finds going to the director's office reinforcing. And maybe going to the director's office is the reason the child's doing this behavior because they know if they do it, they get to do something they like to do. And so by taking that kind of detailed data, you will really get a good picture of what's going on and you will be able to notice patterns. The downside to ABC data is that it's pretty time consuming to complete because you have to jot down so much information every single time a behavior occurs. And you need to do it very consistently so you can really see those patterns. And you need to do it ideally for several days to really get a good feel for the pattern. A lot of times with ABC data, the best way to collect it is have somebody else observe and collect it. So if possible, see if you can get an extra aide in the classroom or have the director come in, or just another pair of hands to either free you up to sit and collect the data or so that person can collect the data. Two other kinds of data that are really helpful. One is incident data. And incident data is a little bit quicker to collect. And this consists of just making a tally mark every time a certain behavior occurs. So maybe every time the child hits, you tally. And then you can say, okay, well, they hit 10 times on Monday, but only 6 times on Tuesday, and then 11 times on Wednesday. And so you can sometimes see some patterns in this. You can see if there's one day of the week that tends to be worse than the others. For some children, Monday may be a hard day, either because it's a transition, because they stayed at another parent's home over the weekend, or because they're hungry because they didn't get enough to eat over the weekend. Sometimes, though, it's just coming back to school. They don't want to come back. For some children, you might find, that there's a certain day that you have a different schedule in your program. And so that's the day that's harder for them. Maybe it's less structured. Maybe that's the day you go out into the community. Maybe it's the day you don't go out in the community. But so you can see some patterns with incident data, but not a lot because it doesn't provide a lot of information. The other challenge with incident data is that it can sometimes be difficult to tally. So if a child goes, how many hits is that? Is that one hit? Or do you count each strike individually? And if you count each strike individually, how many hits was that? I can't tell you, and I just did it. So you watching, you probably don't have any idea. And so tallying, even though it seems pretty simple, with behaviors that are very frequent or behaviors that don't have a clear beginning and end, it can be very difficult. So that tallying or incident data is easiest with behaviors that are relatively infrequent, meaning they happen a few times a day or less, or and behaviors that have a clear beginning and ending. The last kind of data, which is the easiest often to complete, and again, it can give some information, but isn't as specific, is interval data. So in interval data, what you do is you divide the time period into intervals. So you could look at each day as an interval, or you could look at each hour as an interval. You could look at each class as an interval. All of your intervals should be approximately the same amount of time. So you don't want to have one interval like maybe arrival is 15 minutes long, then your first activity is an hour long. You don't want that because then you're comparing apples and oranges. So you want all your intervals to be about the same time length. And then what you do is at the end of that interval, you just circle, did the behavior occur? Did it not occur? And that's it. Did you see it or didn't? It doesn't matter if it happened 10 times or if it happened one time. If you saw it, you circle yes. If you didn't see it, you circle no. And so interval data is relatively easy to collect. You just need to remember at the end of each interval to circle yes or no. And it can also allow you to see some patterns, just like incident data can. However, it is not as sensitive to change. So it may be harder with interval data to determine if a behavior program is working, because if the change is gradual, you may not see it in interval data. The other thing is that you can artificially make the behavior look better or worse by changing the length of intervals. So let's say I'm a child who hits 5 times a day. And so you start out using data that is every hour. So if I hit 5 times a day, there are going to be some hours when I hit and some hours when I don't hit. So maybe it says, okay, well, she's hitting during 60% of intervals. Then you change your data to be on an interval of an entire day. So at the end of the entire day, you just circle, did I hit or didn't I? Now I'm going to be hitting at 100% of intervals, because 5 times a day means so I hit every day. So it makes it look like it's worse. It went from 60% of intervals to 100% of intervals, but that's because we lengthened the length of the intervals. And so, selecting what's the most appropriate interval for that individual can be challenging, because we want an interval that's small enough so that we have some intervals without the behavior, because that makes it more sensitive to change. But on the other hand, we want intervals that are large enough that it doesn't overly burden the professionals with that data collection. If you're in a psychiatric, like a neurobehavioral unit, for significant behavioral support in a hospital setting, they're likely to be collecting behavioral data based on 1 minute or 5 minute intervals. You can't do that in a community-based setting, whether it's a school or adult services. And so you're going to be looking at maybe hour-long intervals. Maybe your intervals will be an entire day. So it will be less sensitive to change. It will be less accurate in that, if you just say, okay, it occurred this day or it didn't, it doesn't tell you as much information, but it does make it a lot easier for you to collect. Interval data is also handy because you can tie it to reinforcement. If you earn this many stars a day or this many points a day, you get a reinforcer. And then you can copy that interval sheet and send it home to families for communication. So interval data is used a lot in school and community-based settings because it is quick, it is easy, and it makes a good communication tool. Just keep in mind that you need to select an interval length, which really has some intervals when the behavior doesn't occur, so that way you can see change more readily.